We want to review Cry Havoc. Cry Havoc is, in all honesty, kind of a monstrosity. And I say that in a loving way. It's an area control, miniatures-driven, tactical strategy game with a deck-building core from Portal Games. If I just listed a bunch of different gameplay mechanisms, trust me when I say that these are brought together in a pretty expert way, and it is a game that has received a tremendous amount of praise, and as far as we're concerned, it deserves basically all of it. In Cry Havoc, each player is going to assume the role of one of the game's 4 factions. And one of the things that's interesting is that different factions are available at different player counts, which is really to say that there's one faction that you only play when you're at max player count. Essentially, there's a faction that acts as sort of the board neutral enemies when you're at 2 or 3 players, and then that faction becomes the 4th playable faction when you hit 4 players. Every faction is vying for, well, points, but you're going to get points through a series of mechanisms. You'll get them from area control. You'll be gathering up these crystals that are the sort of unobtainium that everybody's trying to get, and you'll also be doing a little bit of deck building. Each faction plays a little bit differently, has a unique starting deck, and these cards will provide your action options for the turn, and they'll give you the sort of movement and player resources that you'll need to take actions on the board, and you'll be able to add to your deck from the 4 terrain decks that you'll draw from over the course of the game. Now, I want to be very, very clear. What you're looking at is not the board setup for Cry Havoc. It's not a game partway through. It probably isn't even a plausible game state. Cry Havoc has a lot of moving pieces. It is not a complicated game, but it is a complex game in some ways. And so we just wanted to put the pieces out so that we showed that there are different kinds of miniatures and the crystals and the cards, but this is not a fair representation of what the game will look like. There are lots of little tokens that go on the board that represent bases, all kinds of stuff that really add to the tactical strategy, but there's a lot of it. So we're not going to go through our usual, even lightning quick description of how the game works. There are plenty of great videos. I think Portal probably has some really good ones for explaining what the gameplay is. What I want to focus on, interestingly enough, is not this board, because this board is cool, but I want to focus on the board that makes Cry Havoc an awesome game to me. It's this one. So this little board is how combat gets resolved in Cry Havoc, and in some ways it's the gameplay core of this big, glossy, beautiful game. And I have to say, for a mechanism for resolving combat, this is about as fresh and as innovative a take on it as I've seen in a board game in a really long time. So let's take a quick look at a broad overview of how combat works. 2 factions vying for control over a territory. Let's say the humans and the pilgrims. And again, each faction plays a bit differently. They each have different unique abilities and starting decks. And we actually think these minis look great. We're not really mini crazy, but the minis in Cry Havoc are really nice and still really functional. They're not spindly or easily broken. Essentially, you're fighting 3 fights every time you come into conflict with another faction in Cry Havoc. You're fighting for control over the area. You're fighting to capture enemy units to prevent them from being brought onto the board or back into the fight. And you're fighting to destroy enemy units, to force your opponent to spend resources to train more or to recreate them. And the way combat works is essentially area control over this board. Every piece from the combat will be brought off the main board over to here, and then attackers and defenders as they decide what the most important thing is to them, will begin to place units on this board, and then will resolve the conflict from top to bottom. Humans have majority, so they get control of the region. There's a tie on capturing prisoners, so nobody gets any effect. And both sides have committed one unit to the attrition objective, which means they will each destroy one unit from the opposing faction at the resolution of the combat. This is pretty big. It turns combat into this very strategic but very simple piece placement mechanism. Essentially, you're thinking about these three different objectives, and you might have cards that will let you switch up your tactics or change things. For example, there's a card that will resolve the combat in the opposite order, meaning that enemies will resolve attrition first, and so you might have a majority and then have a unit destroyed and suddenly not have a majority. But essentially, all you have to do to resolve combat is think in terms of which of these objectives do I consider important, probably all of them. Can I control each of these three different objectives? And if not, how can I sort of figure out where my opponent's going to be placing their pieces? Because that's really what it's all about. The combat is all about figuring out the mind game of who's going to put what where. It's a very unique take on this idea of a tactical combat resolution, and we think it's incredibly well designed. Cry Havoc is a big, pretty, well-designed game. It's, as I said, there is complexity, but it is not complicated. There are plenty of decisions that you'll need to make from turn to turn, but in the end, your objectives are kind of driven by your faction's unique take on things and what your opponents are doing. In that way, it's strongest at higher player counts, which is kind of surprising for us because we tend to like games that hum well at the 2 or 3 player mark. But the truth is, to get the most out of Cry Havoc, you need Havoc. You need lots of people on the board knocking into each other, using this really brilliant conflict resolution mechanism, building your deck. It all hangs together very nicely. It's fine at 2 players, hums at 3, and sings at 4. As soon as all 4 factions are on the board, it's a great big awful melee, and that's really fun. Normally we don't love games that are all about mashing into each other, but there is something about the deck building, card action selection, and conflict resolution mechanisms that are somehow compelling to us in this really interesting way. We shouldn't have liked Cry Havoc as much as we did, given our tastes as gamers, but the truth is, we think it's really, really solid, and we think that the production is ultra high. We think that it is extremely playable. It's more accessible than perhaps it first looks, because when you look at the board, Jess described it as the risk sweats started, and she wasn't super thrilled about it, but it's not cumbersome. It's just fun. I'm Andrew from Gameosity. We'll see you next game.